Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, March 25th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the state of Pennsylvania and a brand new Susquehanna University poll that has given us our first poll of the election cycle that shows Joe Biden's percentage in this battleground state increasing to 50% to Donald Trump's 45%. With President Biden's new poll that shows him in a very, very strong position from the state of Pennsylvania, it has fit into this narrative that has been formed over the past couple of months that Pennsylvania, out of all of the swing states, has become the Biden stronghold. A considerable number of polls across the United States, ranging from states like Arizona and Nevada and Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina, and Georgia, have all shown Donald Trump with tremendous leads relative to his performance in the 2020 election cycles. States like North Carolina, where he won by 1 point in 2020, showed Donald Trump ahead by 5, or states like Georgia, where Donald Trump lost to Joe Biden, with him also ahead by 5. Michigan, in which Biden had won by 3, Trump is ahead by 4, and in Wisconsin, in which Biden had won by 1, Trump is ahead by 1. In Nevada, a state Biden had won by 2, Trump leads by 4, and in Arizona, a Biden state from 2020, Donald Trump leads by 5 to 6. But Pennsylvania is the narrowest state so far, with an average here of showing Donald Trump ahead by 0.5%. But the interesting thing here is that the local pollsters done in this state and the A and B rated pollsters, according to FiveThirtyEight, show Joe Biden with an overall average lead in this state, contrary to many other battleground states. In fact, the numbers show amongst A and B rated pollsters across the country, Joe Biden loses all the swing states except for Pennsylvania. But what it shows too is a narrowing in Rust Belt states like Wisconsin, like Michigan, states that vote in unison, and often, you find this to be true, dating all the way back to George H.W. Bush, the last time these three states broke away from one another, this blue wall, as we call it. But another fact is that these states often goes to show that trends here are consistent. It isn't just that the victors end up being the same, but the trajectory of these races and the narrowing of races and the improvement for candidates tends to be similar across Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. But right now, President Biden is looking to Pennsylvania as a prime opportunity for a battleground state that Republicans are really looking to make advances in, not only in the presidential election, but also down-ballot Senate elections and House elections. But fundamentally, Pennsylvania is a state that voted for Biden by 1.2% and has recently gotten more and more Democratic, more and more pro-Biden, and just more and more pro-Democrat at large. And it's an interesting contrast with practically every single other pollster that we're taking a look at and every single other poll that we're seeing across the other battleground states. But the fact is, Susquehanna University, which is a university in the state of Pennsylvania, has released their poll showing Joe Biden with a 5-point advantage. Now, for full context, back earlier on in January, you saw that Donald Trump was losing to Joe Biden by roughly 8 points, according to Susquehanna. Now, this was largely talked about as an outlier poll. It did show, though, that there was, in fact, Biden support across the state, but the 8-point lead was never really grounded in reality. We always knew that Biden wasn't going to be winning the state by 8, and at this point in time, Biden had been practically losing across a number of the battleground states. It really didn't make sense that this state was popping out with an 8-point advantage. But what Susquehanna University is very, very good at doing is predicting, one, the eventual margins, and two, overall predicting vote share. Back in 2022, we can take a look at what Susquehanna University said was going to be the result of the 2022 Senate race. And honestly, against Republicans' wishes, did overestimate Republican support, saying that Dr. Oz was going to receive 48% of the vote, when in reality he received 46% of the vote. And John Fetterman was predicted to get 47% of the vote. He actually got 51.2%. And so the poll, according to Susquehanna, was off by roughly 6 percentage points, something that honestly, Democrats look at and say, this might be good news now that they're showing Joe Biden ahead with 50%. But the problem that lied in the fact that none of these were able to, correctly predict the outcome of the Pennsylvania Senate race is that they never really predicted a majority, but all of these were plurality victories. They didn't really capture in undecided voters in the same way that Marist College did, which shows an interesting result here with John Fetterman ahead by 6 as the only major pollster across the state of Pennsylvania that got things correct. Now, they actually have taken a stab at some of our, other swing states. I don't believe they've done a poll in the state of Pennsylvania just yet, but I'm interested to see, given that it was the most accurate one back from 2022. But even in 2020, Susquehanna University was the last poll that was taken, again, predicting a plurality victory for Donald Trump over Joe Biden by a singular percentage point. The interesting thing here, though, is that the RCB average was nearly identical to the actual results. But Susquehanna, yet again, underestimated Democratic support with underestimations for Joe Biden by roughly 2 percentage points. But again, it was this problem here. They had yet to clear a majority in any of their polls except for one that had dated way further back in this election cycle. The one that we had prior to this poll, let's see if we can find Susquehanna University, showed Joe Biden ahead by 2 points. Again, a plurality victory, but in some cases, they tend to be correct. They did a poll back in August, I believe. Let's see if we can find it here, showing John Fetterman ahead by August 20th through 28th with a 5-point advantage, but it was nearing a majority, right? You were nearing 50%. He was getting closer and closer, and I think that's something that goes to show that, while it's not necessarily the perfect pollster, it's underestimated Democrats quite significantly back in 2020 and, of course, in 2022, but they tend to get some things right. I will also say, they have a high ranking and they have a high rating according to FiveThirtyEight. And they're local, which means I tend to trust it a little bit more than I trust some of the more outside firms that don't know this as well, right? They don't know the state as well. They don't invest all of their polling resources and infrastructure into states that are either Pennsylvania or like Pennsylvania, like Michigan, and like Wisconsin. And so when we see numbers out of the state that show Joe Biden improving in regions of the state that John Fetterman and Josh Shapiro saw major improvements that resulted in their victories in 2022, that's starting to build this idea here, same trends we saw in the Supreme Court election, that Joe Biden is probably making gains in Pennsylvania for a variety of reasons. While I do think this race is going to be exceptionally close, I do believe that Pennsylvania today is in the Joe Biden column. It has been one of the few states that has been consistently more in line with President Biden than any other major, state in this country. And a combination of things could be at play here, right? For instance, Joe Biden is from Scranton, Pennsylvania. He makes that a foundational point of his campaign. It was a pillar of his 2020 presidential bid in Pennsylvania, focusing on this state. And while the victory wasn't massive, it's something that Democrats were proud of. They had flipped back a state that Donald Trump had won by just under a point back in 2016, and it was a state that they were historically very strong in, but they knew that Donald Trump had tapped into something different in this battleground state, something that Republicans traditionally just can't tap into. Even people like Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley, in some cases, were underperforming Donald Trump in states like Pennsylvania. But Joe Biden still seems to be holding his own. I find it to be also very interesting that this underperformance in 2022, if applied to 2024, would show Joe Biden winning in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Very similar to this idea here that, a lot of them do move in favor of certain candidates together and often vote in unison. Even states like Michigan, we've seen recent reversals in terms of support for Donald Trump. At one point in time, you saw him ahead by 5 points across nearly the entire month of February. It narrowed down to 3.6%, and today is at roughly 3.7%. But you've seen a reduction in support over the past month for Donald Trump, and in some of the more recent polls, the ones taken around this month, of March here, The Hill and Emerson College showed a tie. Mitchell Research shows Donald Trump ahead by 3. And again, it's never going to be perfect, but trends seem to be consistent. The same thing can be said in Wisconsin here. While Donald Trump does have a new lead with that 4-point advantage from the Morning Consult, Marquette University, more of a local pollster here shows a tie in this race. Emerson College shows Trump ahead by 4. Fox News shows a tie. So I will say, while these states are much more in favor of Donald Trump than I think you could argue Pennsylvania is, just looking at election results, just looking at where we are, Michigan, I think, surprises many Democrats because it's a state that voted for Biden by the most, but is now voting for Trump by the most. And we can talk about that in a future video, talk about the Arab American communities that are voting uncommitted and not voting in the general election, talk about lack of enthusiasm in college campuses in areas that really matter, like Ann Arbor and Michigan State University, other parts of the state, Lansing, different parts that Democrats, Kalamazoo, right, where you've seen decreased enthusiasm for Joe Biden, contrary to 2020. There's reasons for this. But of course, this video focuses on Pennsylvania. And again, as we talk about these states trending in similar directions, moving in, motion, not moving in motion, moving altogether, it brings us back to our electoral map. It brings us to our electoral math, too, about Joe Biden's pathway to the presidency. Now, I've talked to you about Biden's super seemingly simple pathway to the White House, and it actually shouldn't be too surprising to most. What it requires is Donald Trump losing a lot of states that he lost in 2016 to Secretary Clinton, with the exception actually of the state of Nevada, the state that Republicans are quite hopeful they'll be able to do well in this election cycle. It would require Joe Biden to win Nebraska's 2nd district, just as he did in 2020, and then comes in the 3 major states we've been talking about: Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Now, looking at it, you're up to 270 electoral votes. Nevada gets dropped from the list from the Clinton states from 2016, and yet Joe Biden still has a pathway to 270 electoral votes. And that matters, right? 270 electoral votes that would give him the win by the narrowest victory probably in modern electoral history. We obviously had a closer one, maybe not obviously, but we had a closer one in the aftermath of the Civil War. But this would be our closest modern presidential election. The only one to rival it, maybe in the year 2000, 271 to 267. That was a very close election. But this one would be closer. It'd be 270 to 268. It would give Donald Trump massive victories, though, in a number of states where, you know what, seemingly they don't matter if Joe Biden has a pathway forward without them. But of course, Democrats are going to invest in them and going to spend a lot of time talking about them. But those are states like Florida, North Carolina, Georgia flips back, Arizona flips back, and Nevada flips red for the first time since 2004. This would be our map here, and it isn't entirely unrealistic. But the state of Pennsylvania in specific, I think, goes to show that there's hope out there for President Biden, that this isn't a done deal election, and that everybody writing off Joe Biden's pathway to re-election is simply wrong. And I think that's really where we are. I also will say, too, what's unique about the state of Pennsylvania, unlike a state like Wisconsin or Michigan or even Minnesota, for instance, Pennsylvania has a different demographic range. And what you find to be more important to voters in this part of the country rather than in the traditional Rust Belt states like Wisconsin, like Michigan, is that they're less focused, in some cases, on international affairs, less focused on things like the border and immigration policy as it relates to jobs. A lot of the times you're seeing Pennsylvania voters, care about different issues, but still largely in terms of political voting, in terms of electoral, power and support for certain candidates, still finds itself, surprisingly enough, aligning with the voters in Wisconsin and Michigan. But I think that Pennsylvania, as a unique state where President Biden is doing better than you saw him do even in 2020, in this state. A 5-point advantage is 4 points better than what Joe Biden got in the last race, right? These things happen for a reason, and I think the Biden campaign has tapped into something correct in the state of Pennsylvania. I mean, it isn't just Susquehanna University. I showed you the average. It's consistent here that Donald Trump is performing worse in Pennsylvania than any other state. Now, I haven't cracked the exact reason as to why this might be. I think that what you're finding is that there are certain states where there are, unique things that matter a lot to voters, where you are seeing improvements for Donald Trump that you might not have been able to expect a year ago. For instance, the crisis at the border and illegal immigration, right? You have issues here that voters do care about, especially on these border states, especially in states like Arizona, or in states where you have a majority or plurality Latino population or a significant Latino population, like states like Nevada, for instance, or Texas, for instance, states like Georgia, where you've seen traditional conservatism and people like Brian Kemp, despite adopting many of the same policy positions and ideological points as Donald Trump, perform well in a head-to-head election against somebody like Stacey Abrams. And now Donald Trump is tapping into that, winning those voters back over. Maybe the suburban reversion is coming back to the Republican Party in the state of Georgia. Really, what happens here is that you are seeing the Republican Party tap into key issues in these states and win them over effectively, win voters over more effectively than Democrats have been able to in some of the other states. And so I think all of this matters. I think so many things when you're looking at Georgia and Arizona and Nevada is that the slate of issues that matter to Sunbelt voters may not be identical to those in states like Pennsylvania or Michigan or Wisconsin. But my point here is the numbers we see in Pennsylvania, I think, should be sort of recharging the Democratic base, that there is a pathway forward, that it would take 2 more states beyond Pennsylvania in Wisconsin or Michigan or even Arizona and Georgia that could result in a presidential election victory. For instance, if Biden maintains Georgia and Arizona and Republicans win even Wisconsin and Michigan, right? With Pennsylvania, so many more opportunities are opened up for a possibility of a pathway to victory that Republicans, just quite frankly, may not have been expecting. It's 19 electoral votes, and it automatically puts Joe Biden ahead of where Secretary Clinton was, assuming all of these states vote the same way, except for Nevada. And so that leaves 74 true toss-up electoral votes that could make or break the election. And Pennsylvania already seems to be getting in more solidly blue. Another thing I am cautious to do in terms of characterizing states, for instance, like Pennsylvania, I'm putting in the blue column again for the sake of this video. But the reason I'm more comfortable putting Joe Biden ahead in Pennsylvania than I am putting Trump ahead in Michigan, even though the lead may be larger for Trump in Michigan than it is for Biden in Pennsylvania, is that I don't necessarily believe these polls are telling us the full story. What we saw in the presidential is that when voters were asked if you had to choose between the two, take out your undecided thoughts, who would you choose? And in almost every instance, Joe Biden saw a significant improvement in support. Even in battleground states, we saw this happen. And that matters because it goes to show that there are voters out there that are saying, you know what, I don't love Joe Biden. I'm, in theory, undecided. But when forced to make the decision, they move over towards President Biden. In Pennsylvania, you've already seen him reach a majority in the most recent poll. Susquehanna University is a very reputable pollster across a unique battleground state that doesn't often get polled correctly and historically has underestimated Republicans, not Democrats. And so seeing here that Pennsylvania is a state where Biden is already at the majority, unlike Donald Trump in any other state. I mean, you can take a look in Arizona, he's under majority, in Nevada, he's under majority, in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in North Carolina. Georgia's the only one that he's at the majority, and that's from recent polls. Every other state, I mean, even if we characterize Georgia as red, leaves 58 toss-up electoral votes. Enough that Democrats have certainly a lot of ground that they can win over and win this election through. And so what I will say is keep your eye out on Pennsylvania. It's been a state that has consistently been pretty strong for President Biden and the one that I am most confident he wins out of the Rust Belt states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. But keep in mind, many of them vote together, historically haven't broken apart since 1988, and I don't think 2024 is going to be that race. So if Pennsylvania is going blue, chances are they are too. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.